Mr. President.
Senator from Texas.
Mr. President, I'd ask unanimous consent. I gather from the parliamentarian shaking her head that there is no quorum call in effect, so I will withhold that request. Mr. President, during the last break in our voting schedule here in Washington, D.C., I was grateful to have the time back home talking with my constituents about the challenges that they are facing on a day-to-day basis. And like we all, I think, try to do, figuring out how we can be helpful to them here in the Senate. I must note that there is usually a huge disconnect between what seems to obsess the news media and the folks living in the bubble of Washington, D.C., and what I hear from my constituents back home, and this time wasn't much different. When I was back in Austin, I received a briefing on the ongoing pandemic response efforts. And like the rest of the country and the rest of the world, COVID-19 hasn't gone away, and we are trying to slowly but surely both adapt and deal with the pandemic. Thanks to an overwhelming response by the federal government initially back during the Trump administration, during Operation Warp Speed, we have access to vaccines that on the fastest timeline that we've ever seen before. Medical science and pharmaceutical companies and the government came together to produce effective and safe vaccines at a historic rate of speed. But even though as the virus itself has morphed, as viruses, I understand, will likely do, we still continue to need things like personal protective equipment and additional tests and antibody treatments for people in my state. Ironically, President Biden ran in large part in 2020 based on the COVID response of the Trump administration, and as we all recall, was pretty harshly critical. But now he seems to have changed his tune. When asked about things like access to testing, he says, well, those are really state responsibilities. Well, passing the buck is a familiar pastime here in Washington, D.C., but I don't think anybody is fooled that this is an area where the federal government continues to play an essential role. And yes, our state leaders have done, by and large, I think, a good job in their respective jurisdictions. The fact of the matter is we still need a plan to deal with the testing and the ongoing effects of COVID-19. Interestingly, people who wanted to get access to things like therapeutics, antiviral drugs, and monoclonal antibodies were told that the federal government would not allow the states to use those particular modalities anymore because the federal government had made a decision that this was not effective against the current strain. But as we know, this virus continues to mutate. We're hoping that we don't go all the way through the Greek alphabet in various forms of this virus. But the fact of the matter is, I think we've all now gotten a little glimpse out of what Washington-run healthcare would look like, starting with rationing based on decisions being made in Washington, D.C. about what should be available to people when they get sick or when they see their doctor. I believe that those decisions are best left to individuals in consultation with their health care provider to make those decisions. But we've gotten a little bit of a glimpse when Washington says no monoclonal antibodies anymore, no therapeutics, antivirals, because they don't work against the current strain of COVID-19, the Omicron. As I said, the virus is probably not going to stop mutating, and unfortunately, I think the federal response, rationing access to these therapies and treatment, could well backlash on the government. Well, appreciative of the dedicated work of all of our frontline healthcare workers. As we all know, they've been pushed to the limits dealing with COVID-19. They're exhausted and, in many instances, burned out. And there's not enough frontline healthcare workers currently. And so what that means is that many hospitals and healthcare providers have to contract with nursing services, and which really are national organizations which hire nurses and then contract out as needed to local hospitals. What that usually means is, because there's not enough local nurses available at the going rate, that they have to contract for prices for those nursing services, many multiples of what ordinarily they would have to do, causing a lot of pain and strain at healthcare providers across Texas and across the nation. On my travels, I went to Fort Worth, where I visited with the University of North Texas Health Science Center to discuss legislation that I've introduced along with Senator Leahy, senior member of the Judiciary Committee, called the Justice for All Reauthorization Act. As the name suggests, this is a reauthorization of very important tools that are needed at the local level to support victims and deliver justice and avoid wrongful convictions. This really focuses on the use of forensic techniques to test DNA and other samples. For example, in a rape kit, which is collected following a sexual assault by a forensic nurse examiner who can collect a rape kit, and assuming it's done properly and it's provided to a lab that performs the appropriate tests, you can identify with almost 100% certainty who the assailant is or was. And so it's really important for us to make sure those tools remain available, including eliminating further that rape kit backlog. It used to be that the rape kits were not tested when identity of the assailant was not in question, because in fact, many times the identity of the assailant is known to the victim of that assault. But as we found out, the power of these forensic tests is immense, and we can rule out somebody based on the DNA test. We can identify people who have perpetrated multiple sexual assaults, because many of these sexual assault predators are serial offenders. And what we found out is, even when the statute of limitations has run, let's say, against a particular sexual assault, many times you'll be able to identify with virtual certainty the individual who committed a subsequent sexual assault for which the statute of limitations has not run. So that remains very, very important. In Houston, which is, we like to say, the energy capital of the world, I sat down with leaders to discuss legislation that I've introduced with Senator Coons, the senator from Delaware, to expand the use of hydrogen technologies in energy-intensive sectors. Hydrogen is a unique energy source. Matter of fact, Toyota, I believe, has developed a fuel cell technology where if you use hydrogen in the fuel cell, you'll not only get propulsion of a vehicle, you will actually get water out the tailpipe. So it's very clean and it's very safe. But the problem is, of course, the expense of this new technology and trying to get it used in places where it makes the most sense, because the infrastructure is critical, both for storage and delivery of the hydrogen for use in these energy-intensive sectors. Texas is already the epicenter of energy production. We believe in all of the above when it comes to energy, and these investments in new, clean energy like hydrogen can help us grow and diversify our state's energy portfolio even further, while continuing to reduce emissions in many sectors that are currently big emitters of carbon and other emissions. So it was great to be back home, as I know we all feel when we get back home, and to listen and to learn from your constituents, not just the official talking points and the subjects that are always on cable news or social media, but about the challenges and the needs and the hopes and the dreams of the people we represent, real people, the 29 million people that I'm privileged to represent in the Senate from Texas. We also hear about some of their problems that they're dealing with, like inflation, and we're hearing more about rising crime, and my constituents are looking to Congress for some leadership and some action. They want to see clear and decisive steps made to address the problems that Texas families confront on a regular basis. But as I said, there isn't a whole lot of overlap, it seems, with the agenda here in Washington by the current majority in the House and the Senate and the priorities of my constituents back home. So the debates in Congress have largely been detached from their reality. It's like living in an alternate universe where we spend more time talking about manufactured crises or political agendas than solving real problems. This year it began with a $2 trillion partisan spending bill. Our colleagues abused the rules of the Senate to pass this legislation without a single Republican vote. And clearly, they were hooked because partisan legislating became the rule and not the exception this year. Our colleagues scheduled votes on legislation that would exploit the cause of pay fairness in order to help trial lawyers, even though wage discrimination based on sex has been illegal for nearly 60 years. They scheduled a number of votes on varying versions of legislation to hijack America's elections because of an alleged voting rights crisis, even though last November in 2020, 94% of respondents to a Pew poll said it was either easy or very easy to cast a ballot in the 2020 election. Now, I had an interesting exchange with the majority leader on this. I actually had a chart that talked about that Pew poll, and he said, well, yeah, we agree, everything was hunky-dory in November 2020, but then it all went down the tubes when states began passing new election laws. But I pointed out to him, or I asked him, I said, well, what's your primary concern? And he said, well, ballot harvesting. He thought that there ought to be more permissive ballot harvesting than is allowed in some states. But he didn't talk about the things like eliminating voter ID or making it harder to protect the integrity of the ballot by making sure that the person, whether they were mailing in their ballot or whether they were voting in person, was who they say they were and legally entitled to vote. But again, we spend a lot of time on those multiple attempts to pass that takeover of state-run and local-run elections. And then there was the so-called Build Back Better bill. I'm sure that was focus group tested so that it would be appealing to people who maybe didn't know exactly what was in it. But then we found out that it was massive tax increases and massive spending at a time when inflation was as bad as it's been in my lifetime, and where the dollar earned by working families goes less and less farther, and in fact diminishes their standard of living because because of the effect of inflation. So the BBB bill, some have called it Build Back Better. I prefer Build Back Broke or Build Back Bankrupt, which clearly would have thrown gasoline on the problem of inflation, along with raising taxes and depress our economy and job creation. It was so expensive and unnecessary that our colleagues couldn't get all 50 members of their own conference on board. And that's what happens when you have a 50-50 Senate with the vice president breaking a tie. This isn't exactly like FDR's New Deal, where he had huge majorities and could basically move the country in any direction he wanted. What you would ordinarily think with a 50-50 Senate is that requires bipartisan consensus building, not trying to go it alone in a purely partisan manner, and it's no surprise that it wasn't successful. Well, obviously, economists have something called opportunity costs. And so what that means, as I understand it, is that if you're choosing to do one thing, that means there are other things that you necessarily cannot do. And that's an opportunity cost. And one of the obvious costs to the American people is the border crisis that has seen more than 2 million individuals encountered at the southwestern border. It's no secret to anybody that the drugs, including fentanyl, methamphetamine, cocaine, just to mention a few of the drugs that took the lives of 100,000 Americans last year through drug overdoses, virtually all of those come across the southwestern border. And the cartels are not dumb. They're actually pretty shrewd. And they figured out that if you flood the zone, you flood the border with massive numbers of unaccompanied children and other vulnerable people, that the Border Patrol will have to leave their station on the border, keeping the drugs and the cartels at bay. That opens up huge avenues of opportunity to smuggle drugs illegally into the United States, in addition to the billions of dollars that they earn bringing people into the United States from more than 150 different countries. I know most people who don't live in a border state or who haven't been to the border, they think, well, these are economic migrants from Central America. That seems to be what the vice president, who's been designated as the immigration czar, so to speak, by President Biden, what she seems to think. And frankly, from the comments of the president himself, he doesn't understand the dynamic at the border. But in reality, what Secretary Mayorkas at the Department of Homeland Security and the Biden administration have done is to lay out the red carpet for human smugglers and drug smugglers and migrants coming from around the world. Early on in the Biden administration, I went to the Del Rio sector of the Border Patrol, and so they told us that over 100 people who they had detained had come from more than 150 different countries. So this is really a global phenomenon based on how much money you have and how much you're willing to spend to the smugglers to get into the United States. And again, we're not, for everybody that we have no record on, we don't know whether they've been sex offenders, we don't know whether they've been murderers or committed other crimes back in their home country. And we also know that occasionally we do catch people who have been deported from the United States because of criminal offenses, who then come back in the United States because of the opportunities provided by the lack of border controls. This doesn't take into account all of the people that the Border Patrol calls the getaways. In other words, we know how many people turn themselves in and try to take advantage of the asylum system by flooding our immigration courts and creating a huge backlog and then melting into the great American landscape. But there are people who do penetrate our borders that the Border Patrol never encounters. And so it's really hard to know precisely what they are up to, but I can assure you, based on my observation and experience, they are up to no good if they are avoiding the Border Patrol. Well, in trying to be constructive, which I believe in trying to do, Washington, D.C. can be a pretty tough place. And for sure, there are going to be things we disagree on, but there are also opportunities to do things on a bipartisan basis. So seeing what was happening at the border, I reached out to another border state senator, Senator Sinema from Arizona, and she and I both reached out to a congressman from Laredo, Texas, Congressman Cuellar, and Congressman Tony Gonzalez. Congressman Cuellar, a Democrat, Congressman Gonzalez, a Republican. So we had literally a bicameral, bipartisan effort to come up with a piece of legislation that we thought that, assuming the administration wanted some help, this might be a good place to start. It's called the Bipartisan Border Solutions Act. But I'm sorry to report that the administration, indeed the Democratic leadership, particularly on the Judiciary Committee that has has jurisdiction over immigration matters, has shown absolutely zero interest in any kind of measures to stop or to reduce the flow of migrants into the United States and to solve this problem. Well, obviously, crime is still a big problem in America, and the border is part of the problem because of the flow of people, unrestricted flow of people coming across the border. But we know last year in 2020, murders, that's 2 years ago now, 2 calendar years ago now, murders rose by nearly 30% from the year prior, the largest single-year increase on record. So crime is definitely spiked for whatever reason and requires a forceful and an effective response. We're still waiting on data from 2021, but so far the picture doesn't appear to be much brighter. A number of major cities have experienced their deadliest years on record. And Americans are taking notice. A poll in November found that more than half of those surveyed believe local crime has gotten worse, a 13-point jump from the previous year. Concerns about national crime rates are even higher. Nearly 3/4 of Americans that were polled believe that crime is up nationally, and they're not wrong. This, of course, is bad news for families, our communities, our businesses, and especially for our dedicated law enforcement officials. Within a 5-day span, just last week, 5 Harris County police officers, that's Houston, Texas, as well as a police canine officer, were killed or injured. During a 5-day span, 5 were killed. An officer was shot and killed during a traffic stop. One was killed during a hit and run while off duty. 3 officers were wounded in a shootout, and a police canine was stabbed with a butcher knife. Amid this surge of crime and concerning acts of violence against law enforcement and civilians, there's a clear need for Congress to step up and act. We need to pass legislation to ensure that our police forces are well-funded, transparent, and held accountable. Unfortunately, this is not a priority for the majority party. The radical left in their base wants to defund the police, and most Democrats seem to be intimidated about speaking up and speaking for their constituents when it comes to stopping or abating these crimes. As I mentioned, families are being also pummeled by the highest inflation in 40 years. And we've all seen prices going up everywhere from the gas pump to groceries to cars to clothes. Business owners, of course, have been hit with a double whammy as supply chain issues have made it even more difficult and costly to produce and sell and ship their products. As I mentioned, gas prices are perhaps the most easily identified area where inflation is eating away at people's paychecks. Drivers are now spending 50% more today than they were a year ago on a gallon of gas. That's not just the big headline-grabbing crisis the Biden administration has failed to address. The National Defense Authorization Bill is one of the best examples of what we should do here in the Senate, an example of bipartisanship. A version of this bill is passed every year for 61 years. And last summer, things appeared to be on track, even ahead of schedule. The Armed Services Committee passed a National Defense Authorization Bill by a vote of 23-3. You don't get more bipartisan than that. Unfortunately, for some reason, the majority leader refused to bring the Defense Authorization Bill to the floor and left the bill to collect dust on the Senate calendar before moving it. When he finally allowed it to come to the floor in late November, he tried to limit the normal amendment process by blaming the calendar. But to no one's surprise, that created a lot of issues and a lot of consternation. You simply can't sit on a bipartisan bill for months and then claim there's no time for a robust amendment process. But eventually the Senate did pass the Defense Authorization Bill before the end of the year, but we can't get in the habit of delaying bipartisan bills in order to meet a partisan agenda. Then there's government funding. We're more than a year into the Democratic-controlled majority controlling the government, and not a single regular appropriation bill has passed. Our colleagues have kicked the can down the road.
For a question?
Does the senator yield for a question?
As soon as I'm through with my remarks, I'll be glad to.
That was the question, was
yield.
how soon that might be, given that we have a 2:15 vote coming up.
Senator from Texas is recognized.
So our colleagues kicked the can down the road when it came to keeping the lights on in the appropriations process in September and in December, and now it looks like they're poised to do it again and will not meet the February 18th deadline. So with a focus on partisan politics rather than bipartisan opportunities, our colleagues in the majority have simply ignored the basic responsibilities of governing. They put the demands of partisanship ahead of the needs of the American people. Rather than reevaluate this strategy and perhaps make a course correction, our colleagues have doubled down. They've scheduled another vote on their partisan election takeover bill, and when it failed, they attempted to blow up the rules of the Senate to create an easier pathway to purely partisan legislation. So there's a massive disconnect between what Democrats in the majority have been trying to accomplish here in Washington, D.C., and what the American people are telling me, particularly my constituents, that they actually need. Families in Texas are struggling to pay their gas and grocery bill, and they're worried about the increase in violent crime. But our colleagues are trying to convince them that they're wrong, and what's more important is a federal takeover of state-run elections and provide additional tax breaks to millionaires and billionaires from blue states by lifting or eliminating the cap on deductibility of state and local taxes, as they attempted to do. So a lot of the time we've had this last year, the opportunity to pass good and meaningful legislation has been lost, and thus the opportunity cost of this partisanship is things that really would make a difference and improve the lives of ordinary Americans. The American people are not asking for a radical transformation of the country. That was pretty clear by the 50-50 Senate that they elected in 2020, as well as a bare Democratic majority in the House. They want safe communities. They want affordable standard of living. They want secure borders. And they want the right to decide what's best for themselves and their families, and not be dictated to or mandated by the federal government. So I continue to hope that our Democratic colleagues will abandon partisanship and use the remainder of this year to support what the American people actually want and need.